No question, the main focus of gardening is the plants themselves. The goal, the outcome, the reward. Fruits of our labor for correctly providing the right environment at the right time. No doubt all we've talked about up to this point has been important, because I believe achieving that baseline of knowledge is really going to help us, especially if this is our first time growing a garden. But now it's time to get into the plants. Hi, I'm Jeff from the Ripe Tomato Farms, and welcome to part 3 of the 4-part video series, Growing Your First Garden. Today's exciting because it's all about the 3 P's of gardening: plants, planting, and patience. There's a lot to cover as always, so let's get into it. Taking our time up to this point and forming that foundation of knowledge is super important, both for clarity and understanding. Without knowing the importance of soil, how seeds germinate and grow, the tools we need to cultivate, and the timing of it all, we're left in a cloud of mystery that makes gardening seem impossible. So while the previous 2 videos have been necessary, now's when the action starts, when the theoretical gets put into motion and we can start growing. Every plant we grow as a food crop has a price, a real set of costs in terms of soil, water, nutrients, sunlight, and time. Some plants like lettuce and kale are cheap. Others like eggplants and watermelon are very expensive. And what I mean by this is the inputs of resources and time are significantly less to grow something like, say, lettuce or spinach than it is to grow something like a tomato or pepper. So, when you're picking the crops to grow in your garden for the first time, obviously start with your favorites. You only want to grow what you want to eat. Past that, we have to look at what's involved to grow the crop to harvest and whether it's worth the time and effort involved. This usually becomes more of a question for temperate growers with smaller windows of warm weather. If you can grow tomatoes and peppers year-round because you live in Florida, that's great. But if you live further north like I do and your summer is finite, long-growing fruiting crops may not be the best choice. Again though, it's a choice. Always grow what excites you and don't let anybody tell you that you can't grow something. Just keep it in the back of your mind and be aware that some crops are more efficient and economically viable than others. There's a million different ways to categorize all the different crops we can grow, both generally and scientifically. But the easiest way is by crop type. First, decide whether the crop you want to grow is an annual. Plants you need to keep planting every year. Or is it a perennial? Plants that live 3 or more years. Perennial plants like this rosemary here usually have a higher initial cost. Not only that, they usually take a bit longer to get started. However, once they do get going, they continue to provide bounty for multiple seasons. Think of them as long-term investments. It's the annuals though that make up the bulk of our garden plantings. And I like to divide those guys into 3 categories, all based on the harvest. Roots, like beets, carrots, and potatoes. Shoots, like lettuce, spinach, and herbs. And fruits, are tomatoes, peppers, zucchinis, etc. The crops that are easiest to grow with the fastest rate of return and the lowest amount of inputs are your shoot crops. Think about it. If you're just growing the crop for foliage, you can harvest them pretty much at any time. Not only that, if harvested correctly, you can often get multiple cuttings off the same plant. Even still, multi-harvesting aside, in terms of just the time involved, you can often grow a shoot-only crop like lettuce or spinach 2, sometimes 3 times successfully in the same window of time it takes a fruiting crop to grow. Shoot crops can be grown outdoors in the summer, indoors in the winter, direct seeded, or from transplants. All else being equal, they're the easiest, most economical crops to grow. And with that shorter life cycle, less is likely to go wrong. And with just a foliar harvest, you're almost always guaranteed a bounty to show for your efforts. Roots and fruits are going to be the next level. Depending on where you live and what crops you choose to grow, they may be direct seeded, or you could need a head start, and transplanting may be required. Everyone's list of crops that they can grow is going to vary slightly. If you're like me, you'll be starting your peppers, cucumbers, and tomatoes early so that they have enough time to flower and produce during the short summer. You see, I need to get them in the ground as 8-week-old plants in the spring, not as seeds. I'm in zone 9, which is quite mild, and there still isn't enough time for those guys to complete their life cycle. But my winters are mild enough that I can direct sow my carrots and beets up to 3 times a year. And something as fast growing as sugar snap peas, upwards of 4 times. As you can see, it's all about the climate and plant selection. While gardening is all about the plants, and rightly so, how we grow them plays the biggest part in our success. As we talked about, there's 2 ways to plant a crop, either by direct seed or by pre-started plants. Further to that, we can either grow in the ground or raised beds, or in containers and pots. So that gives us 4 ways to plant our crops. There's nuances to each one, so let's go over them so that there's no surprises when you're planting your first garden. The term container gardening is a bit of a misnomer. Yes, we're growing the plants in a confined space, but the potential has far less boundaries than you'd think. Many growers are going to be restricted to pots and containers simply because of space issues. Living in an apartment or condo will preclude these gardeners from large raised beds or unlimited rows of crops. There'll be more than a few of you container gardening exclusively, and that's okay. In fact, more than okay, because amazingly, almost every crop can be grown in containers. If you get a chance, check out my top 10 list of patio crops to grow right here, and you'll see what I mean. With the right soil, container size, and sunlight hours, no crop is off the table. You can direct sow containers, or you can employ transplants. Watering can become an issue as containers drain far faster and they lose moisture at a greater rate compared to a traditional plot setup. But there are workarounds to that, and it's not a deal breaker. In addition to that list of patio plants, I'll throw a ton of links down below to specific crops designed for container gardening. These videos detail the crop every step of the way. You'll see that no plant is off limits, so don't feel that you're being left out if you don't have a huge backyard or acres of land. Okay, that was a bit of a rant on container gardening, but it was an important discussion. Let's switch gears and talk about direct seeding versus transplanting and the techniques involved. Direct seeding is easy, probably the most straightforward way to planting a crop. And there's 2 ways to physically direct seed. One is to dig a little trench, place the seeds inside, and then cover them back up. The other, which is what I like to do, is to sow the seeds directly onto the surface of your garden and then cover them with a skim coat of soil. Cover them with enough to simulate the desired planting depth, and you're done. Now, not all seeds are planted at the same depth, so make sure to check the seed packet for that crop's particular requirements. Also, as we mentioned before, some crops are overseeded to compensate for germination issues and then thin later. On the other end of the spectrum, we have crops like corn and peas that are simply single-seeded. One trick though that some gardeners like to do if seed viability is in question for those crops is to double or triple seed them, and as long as one germinates, you're going to be okay. Thin to the strongest plants a couple weeks after they sprout, and then carry on like normal. Transplants like this winter lettuce are much more straightforward when it comes to planting. The suggested adult spacing for pre-started plants is observed right away, right when you plant them. And with their big head start, planted right when the weather warms up, they grow like crazy. However, there's 2 key things you need to know when dealing with pre-started plants. Those that are coming from indoors must be acclimatized to the harsher conditions outside. We call this hardening off. The sun, wind, temperature exposure, it's all different and much more severe than the cushy conditions of inside. Bring the plants out for a few hours every day over the course of a week or two to condition the plants properly. Second, no matter how tough and hardy the crop is, try to transplant on calm, overcast days. Never transplant on windy days, nor in the heat of the sun if possible. Give the plants the best chance at getting established. Starter transplants are big business, and you can buy them every spring. They're available everywhere, and the prices are pretty reasonable. Variety is often limited, however, whereas seed packets are not. So I always choose to make my own. For those plants requiring a long growing time, you'll want to start your seeds early indoors around 6 to 8 weeks before that last spring frost date. Again, that date is going to be different for everyone, and it's dependent on where you live. Regardless, you want to give the plants a good head start. We want to get them really established, but not too lush and overgrown. If you're doing a few plants, paper cups or small pots work just fine. You can even make homemade mini biodegradable pots from paper towel rolls as well. Anything that holds soil and drains water will work. Now, once you really get into it and you're doing a variety of plants, you'll find that the professional nursery plug trays work the best. They're a perfect size to get most plants a good shoot system with a supportive set of roots. But whatever you choose, make sure it holds soil and drains water. Okay, as we said before, most seeds germinate best between a range of 80 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Indoors, this usually isn't a problem. In this range, most seeds are going to germinate in around a week to 10 days. Make sure you have adequate light, because without it, the plants go looking for it. They'll grow long and leggy, and that's not what we're after. LED lights do work the best, and compared to just a few years ago, they're quite inexpensive. But you know what's even cheaper? The sun. A nice sun-facing window can grow you all the seedlings you want. And before I had LED light setups, I grew thousands of plant seedlings to transplant into my garden. So spending money is not always necessary, nor the best option. As for nutrients, 1 or 2 feedings of a dilute liquid organic feed should be enough. Once at around 3 weeks of age, and then again a few weeks later. Many people, myself included, move their transplants along to larger pots around a month or so. If that's the case, you can skip the liquid feeding altogether and just use a rich potting mix to sustain your young plants. Minimize those inputs to maximize your garden profits. So, plenty of light, don't overwater, and start them with enough time so that the plants are well established in time for that spring planting. Okay. Exciting stuff, right? Maybe a little too exciting, which brings us to our final P, and that's patience. Patience on 2 fronts. 1, not to start too early, and 2, not to take on too much. Even as I'm talking about it right now, I want to go seed all of my tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, eggplants, zucchini, carrots, beets, squash, chard, all of it. But for my area, it's just not time yet. You really have to think about your planting windows for your climate zone. Be mindful of the growing timelines for each crop and be strategic in your planting. Don't bite off more than you can chew, especially in your first season. Try a few potted plants, try a couple direct seeders, and hey, try your hand at the more elaborate fruiting crops. Get a feel for how each plant type grows and build off that experience. Gardening is a lifelong journey. And if you're just starting out, enjoy the process and absorb what it teaches you. All right, that was a big one with lots of important concepts. Hopefully by this point, you can visualize your garden all coming together and you feel that confidence growing as we get closer to planting time. And we're nearing the home stretch. In the next video, the final in the series, we'll end on the 3 H's of gardening. Happy, harvesting, and health. Hope to see you there. Hey, thanks so much for watching, guys. I appreciate the support more than you know. And if you're getting value from these videos, please like and share them to spread the word and help your fellow gardener to grow better.